Welcome everyone. Oh my God, it's so nice to see everyone in person. It has been a minute. I'm Christine McGowan. I'm with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and I'm also the coordinator of the Vermont Forest Industry Network, which is bringing you this summit, which we are really excited to finally be able to do. We had one scheduled for 2020, and then that didn't happen, and 2021, and that didn't happen, and so here we are, 2.5 years later. And of course we know that COVID is still with us, so just for a couple of quick housekeeping, feel free to wear a mask if you are comfortable doing so. There are extra masks at registration, so feel free to use that. Can we hear? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So there's extra masks at registration. And then we were planning to have all of our meals outside, but the weather, the Vermont weather, is not necessarily cooperating with that. So tonight's dinner is going to be in here in the ballroom, but tomorrow it's looking like good weather, so our breakfast and lunch should be outside. So feel free to space yourselves out and do what you need to do to feel comfortable. But we have a really great program for everyone. And honestly, the only reason we were able to have such a great program is because of the people who helped put the program together. And so it was really our network steering committee and the Working Lands Enterprise Board's Forest Economy Committee. So if you sit on one of those committees, raise your hand or stand so people know who you are. Come on, I see a few. Come on, there's Charlie. There we go. We've got some folks. So these are folks who helped put this together. So thank you. We have, this event is really about networking and getting to know each other and building those relationships. And of course, being able to do that in person is so important. And so the networking aspect of this, we've really tried to design it so that you have plenty of time for talking. So there are exhibitors out in the day lodge, and so please, during the breaks and at happy hour, please go visit them. You should have gotten a bingo card when you registered, and at all the tables there are stamps. So be sure to get at least 10 stamps and put your name on the card, and you're going to enter your card in for a raffle. We've got some incredible raffle prizes. We've got some Darn Tough Socks, we've got Cabot Creamery, we've got a print by Katie Babick Designs, we've got something from Treeline Terrains, and we've got, what am I missing? I know we have something else. Anyway, I can't think of it at the moment, but, Woodsies from Better Wheel Workshops. Anyway, those are all out on display, so take a look at them. You do have to be here to win your raffle, so tomorrow at lunch is when we're going to do the raffle, so stick around for that, and these are awesome prizes. So, let's see. The other thing we're here to do is to learn, and so if you happen to be a forester or a logger, there are SAF credits and LEAP credits, so again, at registration, you can sign up for those, so be sure to do that if you're looking for those. And if you happen to be an architect and are looking for AIA credits, our mass timber session tomorrow will be offering those credits. So Ricky McLean, who's going to be running that session, can help you with that. And there is a post-summit tour. So hopefully, again, I think the weather is going to cooperate tomorrow. So after the summit ends at lunch, from 3 to 5, there's an optional post-summit tour that our friends at Kingdom Trails are offering. There's a bike or a hike option. So you do have to bring your own bike. There are a couple rental places in town if you need to do that, but feel free to do that. And there is a hike option. Just make sure you're wearing good shoes. The sign up is by registration, and you will need to just sign a waiver. So, but yeah, let us know if you want to do that, because it should be a great time. And really, this event would not really happen without the support of all the people who are part of our forest economy. And many of our exhibitors are also our sponsors. And this year, we asked for people to sponsor, and I was really kind of blown away at how many organizations and entities really wanted to sponsor this, and I think it speaks volumes to how much people care about our forest economy here. So I want to give them a shout out, and I want you to hold your applause, but I want you to listen to who is here, who is representing, and be sure to look for those folks. They've got sponsor on their name badge. They want to talk to you, and if you don't already know them, you should, and if they're organizations, you should be part of them. So really a big, huge thank you to the sponsors Vermont Woodlands Association, the Vermont Forest Products Association, the Vermont Woodworks Council, the Logger Education and Professionalism Program, the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, the Northern Forest Center, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Forest Products Accelerator Program at Due North Co-working and NBU, Vermont Technical College, Vermont Manufacturing Extension Center, the University of Vermont Extension Forest Business Program, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative's Vermont Chapter, the Flexible Capital Fund, the Vermont Community Loan Fund, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, Silvicoral, the Treehouse Hardwoods and Mill Shop, Weyerhaeuser, Champeau, the Hardwood Company, and Whiteout Solutions. These are our sponsors. Give them a huge round of applause. All right. And I want to say a huge thank you also to our funders, the people who fund the program and really enable us to be able to provide things like the summit and all the activities around it. So thank you to the Northern Border Regional Commission, the Vermont Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and the High Meadows Fund, which is now part of the Vermont Community Foundation. So thank you to those funders as well. All right, so we need to kick this off. And really, I can't think of a better person to kick it off than somebody who really cares deeply about our forest economy. He is an author, he is our Vermont State Forester, he is the Commissioner of the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. Please welcome Michael Snyder.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for that. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks to all. I don't want to add my thanks to all who helped make this happen. Staff, committee folks, volunteers, and that great list of sponsors. What a great indication of support from a broad range of interests and partners. So thank you. And thanks to all. I'll just get a little closer. Thanks to all of you, frankly, for taking time to be here, to join in the summit, and importantly for all that you all do in all the various ways that you do things to contribute to Vermont's forests and our forest economy, which both provide so much to our state. Given the importance of forests and the role of good forestry in keeping forests and keeping all those benefits rolling for us, the importance of our state, our economy, our culture, our quality of life, the livability of our state. I really am truly honored to be here as commissioner and the people that we work with to kick off this summit, because it just stands for so much and is so important. It's also good to be in Burke. I can't resist saying that welcome also to Darling State Park, which is right out here. Burke Mountain being one of our 7 ski area partners that lease land from the department for outdoor recreation and public benefit. Just couldn't help putting a little shout out there, but it's always good as landlord to come keep an eye on things. So. The hotel, just to be clear, is not on state land, but just over there it is. It really is nice to see you all. It's been far too long, for sure. Great to see so many familiar faces, and I'm happy to see folks that I don't know necessarily, and look forward to the chance to visit with you and get to know you further. I hope everyone will seek out new folks and network here beyond the familiar while you're here. It's a great opportunity, and especially when you think about having looked through the registration and all, it's really a broad representation, and that's important and exciting, and it's also powerful. So I encourage folks to mix it up as you're here. While I'm at it, before I offer just a few brief remarks in opening and to welcome our keynote speaker, I wanted to just acknowledge a few folks, friends and supporters that are here, including Representative Vicki Strong. Thank you, Vicki. Representative Terry Williams, former and possibly future Representative Dave Potter over here. Good to see you, Dave. And I'm looking around to see others. Having scanned the registration, I know we are also expecting Sarah Waring, USDA State Director for Rural Development, Will Stevens, former state representative, and here representing U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, State Senator Andy Perchlik, State Representative Laura Sibiliak, Representative Catherine Sims, Representative Charlie Kimball. I hope we'll see all those folks if I haven't seen them yet. But thanks for your interest, your support, and your work on behalf of forestry, and for joining us at the summit. And for Vicki and Terry, I just want to acknowledge in front of folks that these folks show interest. They show up. They support. They listen to constituents. They have real interest in what we all stand for and do, and we should be grateful for that under the Golden Dome. So thank you, folks. It is a great agenda. If you look through it, with a wide range of topics and presenters with expertise, and I think there's a lot to be gained here. And I guess I would just like to kick us off by simply, I guess I want to note 3 facts. I would call these immutable, undeniable facts to frame what we're doing here. 1, forests, forestry, and our forest economy have a fundamental and outsized positive role in making the very best of Vermont, making Vermont what Vermont is. Along with our friends in agriculture, it's arguable the most important sectors of these working land sectors. And though the land certainly works, it's the people who work the land that make all that happen. And so forests, forestry, and forest economy I think it's just a fact that although others have tended to overlook it or take it for granted, there's no denying forests and forestry have an outsized positive role and importance in our state. Fact number 2, all 3, forests, forestry, and the forest economy, we mean all of its elements: forests, landowners, foresters, loggers, truckers, sawmills, wood manufacturers, craftspeople. That whole network, though it's important, all of it's also challenged and threatened and under stress. So fact 1, it's important. Fact 2, it's stressed and facing significant historic challenges. Fact 3 I'd like to submit is there's a reason for hope, despite those challenges and because of that importance. And I think I'm going to make some points to try to point to evidence that there's hope. And that hope and the positive opportunities that lie ahead are why we're here and why we need to keep at it. A lot is at stake. It's not guaranteed. We have a chance. We have a good chance. And you all represent the best chance that we have in fulfilling the promise of Vermont's forested landscape well into the future. I think the Summit program does provide great opportunities to examine the range of these challenges with a hopeful eye turned toward opportunities. Opportunities and strategies for supporting, strengthening, indeed modernizing our forest economy, and the legal, the institutional, the cultural, and the economic frameworks that support it or hinder it. That's our challenge. I would say that the COVID pandemic and the looming specter of climate change both shed an incredibly bright light on the importance of Vermont's forests and the role of good forestry in our future. From the major surge in outdoor recreation demand of our forested landscapes and the pressures it brings, to a spike in land transfers and conversion from forest land to non-forest use. These are all happening at historic rates right now. To supply chain disruptions that we've all experienced and continue to experience. And also, early in the pandemic, though not all, but seeing that some elements of this forest economy were deemed essential businesses. New understanding, new light on this importance. There's also a growing understanding, fact-based, science-based understanding of forests being both vulnerable to climate change, as well as being our very best source of mitigation and resilience. These have all helped, I think, over recent years, particularly through the pandemic and our response to it. They've all helped, I think, to put this light on the importance of forests and how lucky we are to still have a chance to get it right in a heavily forested state that's largely in pretty good shape. Indeed, I think it's shown how vulnerable we are to global forces well outside our control here in Vermont, whether they're market-based global forces or climate-based global forces. They're real threats. And so I think it's arguable that there's perhaps never been a time when our forests and the people who own, manage, steward them have been more relevant or valuable in society. And think about that. I think that's arguable, and I think that's really quite saying something when you consider there's never been a time in the history of humanity where people weren't utterly dependent on forests and the goods and services they provide. Never. And yet, I'm saying, you've never been more important than right now, especially given what the pandemic and our realization of the climate change emergency tell us. Forests are a part of the answer, if we get it right. Really important. Even if we just seem so, it's true. It's this inextricable value, and yet somehow it's not really been connected to most folks, right? Most people don't really see that. We've taken it for granted, largely as a society. You have. You live it every day. But that's something we have to deal with and take our story out and help others see this, that we are utterly dependent on forests, including wood, goods, and services from forests. And that means dependent on all of you and what you do. Now's the time to change that taking it for granted, because it's not necessarily guaranteed to be here forever. There are real forces working against it. So this is the moment to seize that opportunity and lock in on a universal society-wide appreciation and a strong strategy for the long-term vibrancy, profitability of our forest economy and the people and businesses that make it all happen. I do think there are some strong indicators that this is happening, even though it's a very big ship and it takes a lot to turn it. From the creation of the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative almost a dozen years ago, I guess now, establishing an strategic investment in farm and forest businesses for real benefit and outcome, to the support for a range of other important policy changes and legislation. Sales tax exemptions for logging equipment, incentives and credits for modern wood heat facilities and installations, establishing the right to conduct forestry operations, a legal protection for what we do in the woods. These have all happened in the recent years, and I think they, among many, many other pieces of legislation that so many have helped with, what they have in common is they reflect this growing and changing understanding and appreciation that what we do is really important. It's complicated, and even if people don't understand it, we can make real positive change, and every little bit helps. Then there's more recent developments that continue this trend. Extending the power purchase agreement for the Rygate Power Station is incredibly important. More so than just, that's a biomass electric facility, but indicating the importance to the rural economy and to the people. There was a bit of an awakening, and many, many people here contributed to that awakening. And I think that's really important. So that was passed, and the governor signed it into law. Despite lots of controversy, lots of real opposition to it, based, I think, on cherry-picked science and inappropriate narratives. But that was overcome by legislators who listened, and that's a real strong indication of a change in attitude and appreciation. There's a small but important change that managed to get through the dust-up about Act 250 modernization. But the governor signed S226, a big housing bill everyone's focused on the housing, and that's appropriate, but within that bill, really important changes to Act 250 where wood manufacturers, wood products facilities are concerned. Granting historic change in permit conditions where aesthetic criteria are concerned, particularly hours of operations, giving flexibility in light of changing climate and difficulties. When I work in the woods, when the ground's frozen, you need to truck at various times to make that work. Permit conditions exist that don't allow it. This is now going to say, nope, that's crazy. These folks need that flexibility, including some with existing permits that can now go back and petition for a change and flexibility in those restrictions on their hours of operations. I think what's best about that is the stories that Vermont businesses came in and told about the need for that change. And they resonated, and we finally got it done, along with, while many, many other pieces of Act 250 legislation did not change. I think that's a really important sign. It's helpful, but it's also a big indication. And then lastly, the legislation the governor signed yesterday in the big workforce development bill. Similarly, within that big workforce bill, which is really important and has implications for the forest economy workforce, which is great, through career tech ed centers, et cetera. There's also a section in there, a few sections that refer to call for the creation of the Vermont Forest Future Roadmap, the strategic plan for the forest economy. It calls on the department to engage with a panel of advisors, to hire a contractor, to engage in about an 18-month process, I think, to put together actionable items, to build on all the reports and studies that have been done before, to think about where we are now, and put forward real recommendations for support and modernization of the forest economy. Planting a flag, once more, building on this work that we've done so far together and saying, now let's really move for the future. Again, really, really good evidence that I think we're onto something. We have some momentum, and there's real change in the growing awareness and support for forests, forestry, and the relevance and importance of our forest economy. I think it's critical that we build on this together, and coming together at the summit to listen and share and learn is key to seizing the opportunity ahead. So thank you all again for being here. Best wishes for a great session over a day and a half, and thank you. Appreciate that. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. That is Terry Baker, the other person in the room with a tie on. I put mine on so he wouldn't feel too alone. I got your back, Terry. And Terry is the Chief Executive Officer of the Society of American Foresters. Full disclosure, I've been a member since well back into the previous century. Very proud of that. Many others here in the room. Terry is a passionate and longtime SAF member, a seasoned leader, and a powerful voice for forestry. He has worked for the USDA Forest Service as a forester, supervisory forester, district ranger, and deputy forest supervisor in Florida, Oregon, Nebraska, Arizona, and Colorado. My sense is now that he's come to Vermont, he'll probably soon add that to his list too. He is a Master of Forestry from Yale University, Bachelor of Science in Forest Resources and Conservation from the University of Florida, and a Bachelor of Arts in Agricultural Sciences from Florida A&M University. Terry believes that SAF has a powerful role to play in helping the public understand the valuable role that forestry professionals play in the sustainability of our nation's forests, our local communities, and states' economies. In other words, Terry gets it. Terry, welcome to Vermont and to this one-of-a-kind gathering. We're really appreciative of your making the trip to be with us, and we really look forward to your remarks. Please help me in welcoming Terry Baker.
I am glad you have a tie on, because that is one thing with this job. I get to be overdressed just about everywhere I go. So it's always nice to have a kindred spirit in the room. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And before I start my remarks, I actually want to ask you to humor me just really quickly, and hopefully this will make sense maybe about halfway through this. So I'm going to ask everyone in the room who is a landowner, would you please raise your hand? All right, let's give those folks a round of applause. All right, someone who works for a mill. Anybody in the room that works for a mill? Let's give those folks a round of applause. Any consulting foresters in the room? Got a few of those. Anyone who works for a state organization? We got one. All right, we got a few, thank you. Here's a real question. Any federal employees in the room? We got two. Let's give those folks a round of applause. And by chance, do we have any students? There we go. Where's it? We got one. So the reason I did that, and I probably missed someone, so anybody I missed, who didn't get a chance to raise their hand? Before I move on. All right, we got everybody. That's any loggers in the room? There we go. Wood manufacturers. All right. Excellent. Capital providers. Oh, thank you. You just made a lot of new friends. Any lobbyists in the room? We've got one. All right. And of course, we had some representatives that were also elected officials in the room, so please, any others in the room, raise your hand and let's give those folks a round of applause. So the reason I like to go through that exercise is, one, to recognize the folks in the room, but two, we have an industry that oftentimes isn't as celebrated as we'd like it to be. And if we can't support each other and hold each other up and just clap every now and then for each other to know that you're not alone, then who will? So thank you for going through that little bit of an exercise with me, and I'll dive into my remarks. And so to add a little bit to my history, I'm originally from the state of Florida. At a part of Florida that many people are aware of. It's called LA, which stands for Lower Alabama. So that is home in the Panhandle and just a beautiful place and not known as well by many folks. But really excited to be here, a chance to spend some time in Vermont and with all of you. My time with SAF has been about 3.5 years. My time with the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, was almost about 20. I'll share a couple of stories from that time, and I think even though they may have occurred different places in the country, they may resonate a little bit with some of the challenges / opportunities that you face here in Vermont. So please bear with me. I will say I had a really good friend that I spoke to about this opportunity to speak, and he said, well, the first thing you've got to do is get up there and tell a joke about maple syrup. You know, and I looked at him and I was like, thanks for that feedback. And if any of you are looking for a new friend, I have an opening. So I let him take that with himself. Where I'd really like to start off is something that I learned several years ago with a challenging forest management project. And I think it's just a great way to start off with a little bit of a story. And it was while I was working in Western Oregon. I walked into a district ranger position, and we just, we'd signed off on a project prior to my arrival called the Goose Project. And when the sales started going up, they were adjacent to a community, and that resulted in some tension, which resulted in quite the uproar and eventually a lawsuit. And the initial ruling by the judge was that we lost. The Forest Service lost on the decision for some very interesting reasons we can get into outside of these presentation. But what I will say is, when I went to the lawyer with the Department of Justice to say, hey, we could and should fight this, you know, we've got science on our side, we're right. And he made a very interesting comment to me that has stuck with me to this day. He's like, you need to understand something about the judge if you're considering appealing. That judge is more concerned with being right than doing the right thing. And I just took a step back when I heard that, and I was just like, all right, what have I gotten myself into? But what really that meant to me was, it was this chance to re-examine the way that I approach things, the way I approach decision making, the way I approach being a forester, even though I was more so in an administrative role at that point. And it also taught me to kind of reevaluate how I approach various other things in my life. So I've been married almost 5 years now. And for all of us to kind of like let this soak in, I'll give you a more personal example. And that is, my wife strongly believes that I leave cabinets open with reckless abandon. And not to say that I haven't at times, but I feel like I've gotten pretty good in 5 years at closing them. And there was one time she just called me out on not closing a cabinet, and I thought to myself, I knew I closed it, I knew it was closed, but in that moment, was it worth being right or doing the right thing and let her be right? So I took my tongue lashing for not closing a cabinet that I knew I had closed for the sake of a happy marriage. So I say that because that's going to actually run through some of the comments that I share with you this morning. So what I'd like to share with that is, as we look at some of the challenges that we face, some that was shared earlier, and I know that all of you are all too familiar with, what is our perspective? How are we approaching them? And most importantly, are we more concerned with being right in this field, which we know the science, we know what's good for the land, but we also know there are a lot of people who care deeply about the forest land that we manage, even though they may not understand the science. So how are we approaching this? What's our perspective? Is it a challenge, or are we surrounded by challenges, or are we surrounded by opportunities? How much effort are we willing to put into those challenges to turn them into opportunities and make them more fruitful for us in the long run? So a great example of that, one of the first ones that comes to me is, how many of you have heard of the International Trillion Trees effort? There's a couple in the room. So this was a international agreement that I believe it's by 2030 to have 1 trillion trees planted. And not 2030, I think it's 2050, sorry about that. But with the Trillion Tree Initiative, they have chapters all over the world, and there is a U.S. chapter. And we were approached by American Forest, which is the nonprofit that is the chair of the Trillion Tree, U.S. Trillion Tree chapter, 1T.org. And they asked us about if we would be interested in pledging to be supportive of the effort as the Society of American Foresters. And after looking at some of our programs, after looking at their charge, we agreed, and we made a pledge, and we're part of 1T.org. And almost immediately after we announced that, I had quite a few members who reached out to me and said, why in the world are we a part of that? They're just talking about planting trees. And so they were absolutely right. This whole thing started around how do we reforest, 1 trillion trees across the world. But what was missing is who's a part of this conversation. PepsiCo, Amazon, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, several other big Fortune 500 and 100 companies are all part of that effort. Their chief sustainability officers are sitting in that room and trying to decide how to invest dollars. Now, what's the nuance of having an organization like the Society of American Foresters and the National Association of State Foresters and American Forests and quite a few other nonprofits in that space? The conversation started to evolve from planting trees being a good thing to working forests being a good thing, and the role that tree planting and reforestation play in working forests, and that there is a benefit there. And all those folks, most of them had no clue. There's a stronger contingent than you probably want to believe in this country that believes once you harvest, that a parking garage goes up. They have no understanding that there are reforestation requirements when it comes to managing forests, publicly or privately. And so the ability of showing up in those spaces versus saying, well, they're just talking about tree planting, they don't get all that we do. Why should we go waste our time with those folks? We have to change that mentality. It is worth the investment. And more often than not, they're really curious about what it is that we do, but it is a very elementary understanding of it. As we know, we go into forestry for communications. I mean, that's what I went to forestry school for. And so that's a challenge, and we know it's a challenge. One as an organization, as a profession, as an industry, as a sector. How do we communicate? How do we start to level the playing field of folks that there will always be who don't believe a single tree should be cut? And there's a balance there. We all know there's a balance on what can and should be cut versus what shouldn't be cut. But how do we start to get that message out there and apply it to ourselves? How do we start to really leverage the reality of who we are and what we do in these moments that were mentioned where we have the light shining the brightest on us? Another example that I will say associated with that same concept is one that I don't know if I wouldn't wish it on any of you, but it happened to me and I think I did okay, which is in that same vein, there are becoming more and more of these random requests. Folks that are curious about how forests work. What is going on? How do we really understand how our forests are managed? What are the threats to our forests? And so last year I had one of those random emails that you're like, this has to be junk mail, it has to be spam, this is not real. When you get an email from C-SPAN saying, we have this program, we think you'd be great to be a part of this program that we have. And I was like, this is a joke. This is a bad joke. I don't like this joke. I do not want to be on C-SPAN. But, on a whim, I responded and said, what's this about, and can you tell me more? So on a phone call, it was a program called Afterwards, and it's something that C-SPAN started related to various books that were being published, and having specialists in a particular field actually have a conversation with the author to discuss what the book was about. This book in particular was about the wildfires in California, and the more we spoke, the more I was like, this is one of those opportunities. Those times when I charge my members with, when are you going to step up into spaces that we don't normally step into? And so I took a second thought and I was like, all right, I'll give this a shot. Now, I didn't fully know what I signed myself up for, because they were like, well, we're going to have to do this in about 3 weeks, and here's your 300-page proof of the book that you need to read and be ready to ask questions for the course of an hour. In that moment, I felt like I was in a grocery store bagging my own groceries. I was like, I didn't know I was going to be an interviewer in my career, but I had that opportunity. And it worked out really well. It was a great conversation and a great way to showcase, again, the concept and the importance of the professionals that engage in this work versus, yes, we see the fires, we see the tragedy and the challenges, but there are folks who are constantly working in that space. And so to have that conversation with her and be able to express that was something that I think is really critical. So I did a little bit of research on Vermont before I came up here. And I saw something, I saw some language about the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that there was going to be a climate council built off of that. Is anybody in the room that's put their name out there to be a member of the climate council? I bring that up, so think about that. I'm glad that you're on the subcommittee, but that's what it takes. It takes us being in these spaces. It takes us being parts of these conversations to share that scientific knowledge and expertise in a room that oftentimes we aren't normally in. Oftentimes we're not invited to, so we have to invite ourselves or put our names forward. Because again, it's very interesting. A lot of folks don't know that we exist sometimes. So it is an interesting space, but it's an important one to start to show up at these things. The other piece that I wanted to share this morning is also, how are we willing to communicate to build trust with those who don't understand what we do? And that's something that I've spent a better part of my career doing, especially in federal service. But it is one of those really important pieces that is oftentimes a challenge, because we're experts, we've gone to school, we've worked in the field, we can speak really intelligently and technically about what it is that we do out in the woods. And oftentimes when someone comes to us and says, maybe they don't agree with what we're doing, and they talk about why they value the forest, what's our usual response? Well, this is an overstocked stand and it really needs to be cut, and this is, and all of a sudden we're having a very technical conversation with someone that's trying to have a value conversation. Those are the same folks that like to go hunting and fishing and hiking in the woods, camping in the woods, bird watching. And I think a lot of us like to do those things too. A lot of us, that's the reason why we got into this profession, is because we want to take care of the land. So it's that reminder that this is an opportunity and a chance to connect with someone on a value basis, not from a technical basis. Because when we start out from a technical standpoint, it's like we're talking down to people. And they shut down. They're not listening. And it's just two people kind of talking at each other at that point. And that doesn't serve the purpose we want it to serve. So how do we start to really think through that piece of what this discussion is, how do we build trust, and how do we move forward? I'll give you a great example. A project that I had where we were doing a big river restoration project, and it was completely, dewatering a stream, ripping everything up, and raising the grade of it by about 10 to 15 feet, and gravel and trees and everything else was thrown into it. And the fish biologist that was the lead of that project came to me and said, everything went great, but I don't want you to look at it. I said, why? She's like, it looks like a bomb went off out there. She's like, it just looks terrible, and I'm afraid of you looking at it. I'm like, I think that's fine. But as much as she struggled with that, she was willing to say that description of her project, which she knew would create the habitat that we were trying to create. Now let's flip that story. What do we say about a timber sale that's been harvested? How do we talk about it? We see something different than most people, and there's nothing wrong with that. We see the jobs, we see the benefits to the community, we see the fuel that is sold, we see what that stand of trees and that forest will look like once it is harvested, going into perpetuity. What it will bring to a community, the forest products that it will create. And that's what we see. And so what is that? Oftentimes that puts us in a place where we struggle to say that a timber sale in the moment that it is cut is not a pretty sight. And again, that's one of those things that takes away trust that people have in us and the work that we do. They don't feel we're being honest with them. Now the nuance then becomes, how do we start to pull those folks into a stand that is a year old, or 3 years from harvest, or 5 years from harvest, so they start to see, this is what this looks like, this is why we're doing this. But it's that realization, the first step is admitting that it's just not that pretty. Because in that first moment, you will either gain their trust or you will lose it. Something that this meeting represents is something that I think is extremely critical for us as a profession, has always been, but especially right now. And that's the power of a united voice. Across our sector, there's so many parts and pieces, so many players that we have to be very aware of and very thoughtful of. When I was considering this position, I reached out to a lot of different friends and coworkers that I met over the years. It was really interesting. And what was most interesting about it was when I talked to people in part of the country, they said, well, if you do get this job, you need to do something about SAF because there's only federal people involved in the organization. Okay? Talk to people in a different part of the country. Well, if you get this job, you need to do something about SAF because only, industry foresters are part of the organization. All right? And that went on and on. And I think one of the nuances and challenges we always have to face is we all have different missions. And that's okay. We can have these disagreements in places that we are among ourselves and what those missions are and why they are. But one of the most important things we have to get out of the business of is pointing a finger at each other, especially in public forums. We have the ability to learn from each other, but the aspect of infighting is something that is truly a challenge that we have to overcome as a profession. You don't have to agree on everything. We shouldn't agree on everything. That difference in conflict is what creates the needed balance when it comes to managing our systems and engaging communities. It gives us a certain level of credibility and keeps us honest. But at the same time, there's a space for it and there's a time for it. And how, as a sector, do we move certain efforts forward? It's when we have that alignment. And there's a lot of different examples of that, either at a state level and also nationally. We discussed, brought up COVID a little bit earlier. There's a group of national associations that met once a year that I'm a part of in Washington, D.C. And we started meeting monthly. To have some of these conversations to start thinking about and talking about what it meant to be essential. And not only as soon as we learned that we were essential and how we had some of those conversations, then how do we get that information out? How do we work with an organization like Forest Resources Association to share, here are letters that you can have for your truck drivers, for your foresters, for your procurement folks, to showcase that they are essential in carrying out essential work during the initial part of the pandemic. It's how we come together and it's how we overcome some of these challenges. The onset of mass timber and what that means to our profession is truly something that we have every right and responsibility to take advantage of. But speaking of being around the table with folks that we don't talk to a lot, architects. I've been able to see this year 2 different programs. One is I think it's at Mississippi State, and the other is in Arkansas, where the architecture departments are creating capstone courses around building with wood and mass timber. and engaging the foresters in that conversation and having these conversations with architecture students about where this wood supply comes from. So again, we're showing up, but we have to keep doing it. It has to become more widespread. It has to become the norm. Because this is an essential part. When the light shines the brightest, that's when we have this opportunity to really make our space and showcase the value of what we do. Not just the value of the forest that exists, but the value of the folks who are working in the forest. My last thought, before we get into some questions, is simply put, so many ways, all this boils down to workforce. How are we going to get all this work done? We've had the passage of the infrastructure bill. That put roughly about between $7 to $8 billion into the federal government, into state governments, into local communities, saying we've got forestry challenges, so here's the money to fix it. And I've seen a lot of folks scramble since that money showed up. And it's one of those things that we have to be really thoughtful about, is that time to prove the model, prove the case. We've always said, well, if we had more resources, we'd have healthy forests. Or here's $8 billion, show us what you can do. And there's an excitement around that, but there's also this challenge of where's the workforce going to come from? My favorite conversation with folks are like, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. I'm like, where are they coming from? We don't have the nurseries to do that. So again, it breeds more conversation and more understanding, because there's this reactionary aspect to our society that we know exists. But then we have to be willing to be part of the conversation to develop an understanding, to set some realistic expectations, or we're not going to succeed. And even though it didn't happen, and there's strong opinions on why it didn't happen, the reconciliation package that was being considered. I'm not sure how many of you dove into that document, but that was going to be another $27 billion related to forestry and forest industry, nurseries, forest management. A group of us actually went to sit with a few different senators, and despite varying opinions on, we went to folks on both sides of the aisle, despite varying opinions on reconciliation package and if that was a tool or not the tool, they all agreed on the forestry provisions. So that should make your ears perk up, because even if that's not the tool, there's a farm bill coming up, and those conversations are starting. So again, this whole piece of we are in the spotlight for very good reasons. And it's time for us to be able to step into that spotlight and really take care of what needs to be taken care of. As I mentioned, this whole piece around workforce is something that more and more conversations are being had. It's something that, again, is a huge challenge, and it's something that we've always known. What is the relevance of our profession? How do we get more people to understand it and want to be a part of it? I wholeheartedly admit, I grew up on a small farm. I enjoyed being outdoors, but I literally stumbled across forestry. And I know a lot of folks with a similar story. So how do we make it more commonplace? And so there's a lot of folks working on that. There's various efforts going on. Actually, SAF partnered with SFI and the Forest Service to do a Green Careers Guide that's going out as part of Project Learning Tree. And there's several more that are being created as far as different efforts just to make what we do more well known, and showcase its importance, and show that yes, we can value forests, but we can also work in forests and do the work needed to maintain their health and sustainability long term. Last but not least, I'll say that whole piece of how do we make folks more aware of what we do. It's something I'm really excited to announce, and it's related to one of your speakers tomorrow, I believe. And that is the Society of American Foresters has merged with Forest Proud. That was announced to our members on Monday of this week. For those of you who don't know Forest Proud, it's a multimedia platform that works on social media to create communications campaigns around forestry and target folks outside of the people who would be sitting in this room, to try to showcase the importance of forest products, the importance of sustainable, healthy management of our forests, and the value of what we do. And so now that organization is going to be part of SAF, and we're looking forward to how we continue to build off of that platform, as well as build some new opportunities for everyone in this room, all of our members, to build skills and engage in certain conversations, because that's going to be a key part of this going forward. Folks want to know what it is. Folks want to know why we do it. So with that, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to let me speak to you this afternoon. It's great to be in the state of Vermont. One last thing from when I was doing my research about this area, the Northeast Kingdom. I saw some very interesting recreation information online. I had this piece of Get Naked. I didn't figure that was this crowd, but I was like, huh. I mean, spelled N-E-K-E-D, but I was like, this is, all right, well, good play on words, well done. But it is an exciting time to be in this space. We have truly quite the opportunity ahead of us. We have our fair set of challenges. We have the ability to look at it from a different perspective and make some amazing things happen. And that has to do with each and every one of you and those who come behind you. So I'm excited to be in this space with you, working on these challenges, sharing information, and looking forward to the results, because our forests need us, and we're going to make some great things happen. So with that, thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with you over the next day and a half.
Thank you, Terry. And Terry's willing to take some questions. And we have a mic here in the center. And we're hoping folks will want to ask a few questions of Terry. So now's the time to do it. Please. Anybody up? I taught for many years, and I got good at just waiting. But I'm also ready to see it. Terry, why don't we look in the crystal ball? What do you see out, say, 50 years for our nation's forestry? You know, the big, we're foresters. We think long term.
We do think long term.
You be thinking, question.
50 years. Whew. You could have sent that to me before I stepped up here. No, 50 years from now, I think that we'll see several key pieces, and actually some of that gets back to the conversation I've had, some of the conversations we had about the reconciliation package. And part of that was there was quite a few, you know, because again, at that point you're starting to throw around hundreds of millions or billions of dollars like it's $5. But this concept of investing in forest products in different ways, both from small diameter material, what some of those options are. And one of the things that I kept bringing up to the legislators were, it's quite simple. It's like, you can throw all the money at forest products that you want, but unless we really create markets that can sustain past government investment, we're not going to be able to address some of these health issues. And I think that there's several things that are on the horizon that really, you know, when we look at 50 years, I think, well, my hope is that we continue to find a balance. I don't think the carbon discussion and the carbon exchange programs that are out there right now are going away. And from all conversations that I've had, there's going to be more and more money put into those carbon exchanges, and that will impact our forests, that will impact our forest rotations potentially, or to an extent. And so there will become a point where there's going to have to be that conversation of what does balance look like when it comes to these types of efforts, because you can't continue to defer harvest for the sake of carbon and create forest health issues. And so those dynamics are going to have to be addressed, and those conversations are going to have to happen, and we're going to hit that point between now and 2050. I think that as we see, you know, variations in climate change, what that does to certain ecology, it will really start to inform where we go from here. You know, the running joke from a few folks that I know back home in Florida is like, we're just going to buy a bunch of palm trees and take them to the Northeast and just wait. Our moment will come and our riches will abound. But it will be this piece of how is ecology moving? You know, when we have research like forest inventory and analysis, the FIA data, how is that going to help inform where we go from here? Because some of the forests that we have in certain parts of the country, those forests have and are and will shift more. So, you know, are we going to act somewhat proactively and try to get ahead of that and understand where that ecology is shifting to from weather patterns and start to adjust the tree species that we're using? How is that going to affect markets and facilities? I mean, there's a lot to think of just in the next almost 30 years that I think is going to play out fairly quickly as we start going through some of these steps and have some of these different players willing to invest particularly significant sums of money into the space that we work in. So,
thank you. Now I'm sure they're all thinking I did give you the question ahead of time.
Yeah.
Well done, that was pro level. So will wood still be good then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. As much as people will tell you bamboo will replace it, woods will still be good in 30 years. It's, I think it's a key resource. I think the aspects that we see, the products that are being made, you know, the conversations about nanocellulose, you just go down the list of benefits from wood. And again, at the same time, it's like how we're going to keep forests healthy, how we're going to keep forests into perpetuity. We have to do something. So there is a need in society as well as the need in the, you know, within, you know, homes and buildings and facilities, paper in classrooms, as well as a need in the forest for us to have a use for wood, be it, you know, our own personal use or doing something with it so it just doesn't suffocate itself out on the stump. So, yeah. Oh, we got a question.
Excellent. Where's the question? And I was going to say, if folks have microphone phobia or walking around tables phobia, we can probably make this work from wherever you are. Is that you, Dave? Let's hear it, please.
Well, I'll talk really loud. I really appreciated your story about the stream reconstruction and the bomb going off. I think most of us here have had that conversation with a person who is less knowledgeable about what we do in the woods, and that green and yellow machinery that are allowed only mean destruction.
Yep.
And after a log job, it is not pretty. And I tell people to walk around and just look at the top 75% of the trees. Don't look at the ground. And what are some tips? I mean, part of what I do on the board of directors of the Vermont Woodlands Association is try to have education and outreach to people to help explain how that works. And we're trying to think of ways to do that. Do you have any hints, or how do they do it in your part of the country? It doesn't work. Is it just preaching to the choir, which are a lot of the folks that we get to come to those workshops?
So first I'll say, I'm guessing you're talking about time in my forestry career, because I definitely don't have any tips for solving that in DC. But no, that's a great question, because that is the challenge. Oftentimes, where I ended up having opportunity, which is almost again kind of that challenge opportunity mindset. The best time to have those conversations, and the times that you get folks who really don't agree with what we're doing and why we're doing it, it's when they're angry. I mean, to be totally honest, when folks really think that there's something that they have a reason to fight, they'll show up. And that puts us in a really difficult place, because I'm sure, like all of you, I'm very proud of what we do. I'm very proud of this profession. And so when someone shows up angry, it puts you on the defensive immediately. And that's at times can be almost impossible to overcome. But I'll tell you in those moments, I'll tell you the most powerful thing you can do. And that is have the conversation from the place of, and this actually probably helps, it helped me kind of diffuse my own defensiveness, which was when somebody came to me and it's like, you're going to clear cut down to the banks of this river and kill spotted owls, and here's all the horrible things you're doing to the forest. And I did two things. One was I would just say, no, I'm not. And as we could joke, but I kid you not, like that would take a lot of like angst out of the situation. But the other thing I would oftentimes follow up with is, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. I'm just here to give you something else to think about. And I think that's the piece of when we talk about education, and is that it's also about understanding, and that we're not going to achieve that in one engagement. But at that piece of not starting a conversation from, again, kind of the higher ground, and you're gonna tell someone why something is the way it is. Just saying like, here's my perspective, and I want to hear yours. And it may be a few different engagements for some folks. For some folks, like you said, you'll have the choir show up, be like, this looks great, we know what it's going to be, what other information do you have for us? But for those folks who don't agree, it's the long game. It's that piece of like, hey, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. Here's just the way that I see it, and my thoughts and my experiences, and love to hear what your thoughts are.
I of a thought related. I just want to follow up, you know, we're talking about the gap and awareness and appreciation and folks that don't see what we see. And I think often about how we're enjoying another renaissance of outdoor recreation in our state, a state that's had a long tradition of vigorous outdoor life. And I look to that as positive in all kinds of ways, but including, it's a great way to connect people to forests and including to see forest management, to understand it. And I just wonder, I know that's happening here, and many of our recreational partners have embraced this, which is really fabulous. And logging contractors embracing recreational trails as something to cherish and protect, using them themselves, for example. So my question to you is just, do you see this, what's your perspective from a national perspective, from your career? Are we onto something here as a means of breaking through another form of common ground and a chance to understand each other?
Recreation, absolutely. I think, and it is definitely something that, you know, it shows up in various forms in different parts of the country, but it is definitely a means, I think, of making some of those connections. But again, a big part of it is us showing up in those spaces. Where can we look at, like you mentioned, logging operations and say, all right, here's either a time or here's a space that we're gonna manage operations to even say a trail can stay open so people can see what's going on. It really is kind of looking at that model a little bit differently, and of course that takes away from efficiency. But what's the trade-off? Is you might not be logging in another area because that area might be under litigation. So it's that whole concept of really starting to think through some of these additional benefits of having these conversations, creating these spaces for folks to see things as much to an action as they safely can, but also just connecting with folks who are out recreating. And I think that either messaging or signage or creating educational materials that are you know, there beside or a QR code associated with recreational trails that may show up on a digital map on a device. So I think it's a great way to start really kind of coupling what this stuff means. You know, this is what keeps this forest in this condition that you love to go experience.
Thank you, Terry. I think I saw a hand. Go for it, please. There you go.
All right.
See, folks? It happened.
Brave soul to the mic.
I guess I'm asking this perspective of a landowner, but just playing off your.
Somebody want to turn the mic on?
You know, maybe not. So I guess we're gonna have to speak loud. From the playing off, you know, looking in the future. Do you see any? I think of technological developments that are gonna. There are going to be opportunities for other types of uses of the forest land that are compatible with forestry. I mean, recreation has always been one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of pressure that is not compatible, whether it be, you know, housing or those type of things. But the examples from the last 5 or 10 years that I would think of is, you know, whoever thought of wind farms, like the wind farms out there, or solar panel farms, that type, you know, cell towers. So, on a national perspective, and maybe one we may feel here, what those opportunities for, you know, other consistent uses of the land.
That's a great question. I'm not sure what's on the horizon. I mean, it would be interesting to see, because you're absolutely right. You know, the concepts of using wind farms, solar panels, these different uses. You know, some of the more historic ones, you know, various types of agroforestry opportunities, and you know, most everyone that I knew growing up in the South had a hunting lease associated with their private forest land. And so I think it's, I'm not sure what they may be, but I think that the critical piece of it is being open to it, you know, and that these are added benefits. I was actually early this week at the Association of Consulting Foresters meeting, and that was a big conversation, in particular about the carbon exchanges. It's like, despite whatever your perspectives are on climate change, the reality is this is a benefit to your landowner. And so how do you start to really frame that in a way that you look at it in that sense? And so I think there's going to continue to be these evolutions that come into play. And I think it's going to be just those pieces of what's a landowner comfortable with. But nothing that comes to mind in particular versus me just fielding a wild guess that may or may not be entertaining. So I'll have to think about that, but if I come up with something, I'll find you.
Thank you. Joe?
One thing, Mike, that you mentioned, and Terry, you mentioned a little bit too, is how important the forests are, and especially in the light of climate change, forests are one of the big answers, hopefully to help solve the problem. Recently in Vermont, we've seen a push to try to protect forests and to grow old forests. We now have a new category in current use for the reserve forest land, which allows certain parcels to manage their land for old forest and still qualify for a current use qualification. And I'm curious, maybe from the national perspective, and maybe also from you, Mike, that it seems to be, there was a push to get this into this category into current use. And I think a lot of folks were hoping to push it a little bit harder. There was a compromise that the governor just signed. I guess the question is, number one, it's hard to argue that reserve forest land and old forests are good for carbon, but is that a threat? Is that a threat that we should be worried about? Is the pressure going to continue? What's the perspective from the national folks about this push towards old growth and more reserve forest?
Great question. Thank you, Christine, because she did tell me about the current use law, and so I did a little digging before I showed up. But what I will say about that is there's definitely those pressures that are out there. I mean, there is also an executive order signed by the president saying we're going to inventory all the old forest on federal lands. So that pressure is going to be there, like I mentioned. There will always be folks who believe that a single tree shouldn't be cut anywhere for any reason. Well, at least especially for a commercial reason. And I say that because I've literally had those conversations. So the reality of that pressure to extend non-harvest will be there. We will always face that. What I will say is, more often than not, that's not a majority voice. Oftentimes, in my federal career, there's always this infamous conversation: how do we engage the missing middle? I'm like, the missing middle doesn't care. That's why they're missing. We haven't risen to a point that they want to engage. When we do, they will show up. And so part of our dynamic is, I think, and what we have to be really careful in those types of conversations are related to what you just mentioned around the current use law, which is, where's the compromise? And I think that is a really critical question that we have to ask ourselves, because it's one of those situations, again, that when someone comes out and says, well, we want to keep pushing this, and there shouldn't be any of that, what do we often do? Well, it's time to fight. And what does that fight end up looking like? That fight looks like we're unable to change. That fight looks like we're unable to compromise. And that's where we lose ground. That's where we have lost ground. And so, where are those things that make sense? Yeah, I don't know of the full details, but the parts and pieces that I was able to read and research before arriving is that, from what I read, a lot of the lands that we're going to be able to go into these reserve forest lands are lands that likely would never be harvested, or not, for access issues or some of these other things. I don't know for sure. I may be wrong. But if that's the case, then what's the fight over? And what does it mean for us to show up and say, no, we don't want this at all, and compromise future opportunities because, again, that we're seen as inflexible? So that pressure is there. It takes many different forms and functions. There's, letters around proforestation, and it's the same concept of, well, if we're going to address the carbon issue, then it has to be locked away and just let forests be forests. But I know, and you know, that's not completely wrong, but it is something that basically ignores the fact that human beings exist, and we have to manage around people and communities and the reality of resources that are needed, and also impacts from natural issues and unhealthy forests. So there's that piece of a balance. Where does that make sense? How do we have those conversations? But a big part of our credibility is speaking to what we know versus trying to speak against someone else.
Thank you, Terry. That's fantastic. Janice, please.
So I'm one of the few capital providers probably here in the room, and I'm curious why that is, because it feels like from a messaging, communicating, educating perspective that my, as a stakeholder
That is a great comment, and thanks for that. I will say, if you know a group that is probably less prone to getting in front of a camera or having a conversation on a stage than your general forestry professional, be a forestry researcher. And so, those folks, that research is happening. The looks at opportunities of what are the new technologies, how do we implement them, what needs to be shared with legislators, what are the pilot opportunities. But you're absolutely right, is that, the concept and thought around where are the forums to actually have these conversations with investors and funders to say, this is what we've put together, and we think that this is a great opportunity to create a market per se for what's now considered low value material, because we focus on dimensional lumber for the most part. So it's a growing question and concern. I know there's a lot of really good conversations happening about that. And it's one of those things that we can look at nationally, but also Vermont has a state forestry association and state forestry organization as well, and that's where a lot of that information can come from as well. So it really is that partnership throughout the levels of the sector that we try to communicate that, but it's not as coordinated as you would probably like and we would probably like. And so I think you raise a great question, and maybe it's a partnership opportunity to create that kind of forum. Maybe at your next Vermont Forestry Association meeting.
I think we've got time for one more. I saw, Joe, your hand earlier. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm interested in what SAF is looking at and tracking from a federal policy vantage point, that, either ideas that are out there that you think advance the interest of our sector or that you're concerned about. And I know that's a big question, so two specific facets of that I'm interested in. One is the demand side of the equation, policy that would help to incent new markets for wood and wood products. And then second are policies that are particularly relevant in a private lands context. That's largely what we work in here. A lot of what we hear is strikes me as more Western focused, public lands, fire dominated. So public policy that is helping to advance markets and relevant in private landscape. Interested in what you're seeing there, and what opportunities maybe are on the horizon and should we be paying attention to in things like park building.
Oof, that's a big question. I'll do my best. What I will say is I mentioned this group of association leaders, executives who get together once a month. Part of the reason we would get together once a year is actually we share a spreadsheet around policy priorities. And that's simply because as diverse as our sector is, there's really no way for one organization to cover it all. So this is a spreadsheet of goodness, probably over 30 plus different aspects of forest policy. And so with that, we have whoever's going to be on the lead and who's going to be supporting. So a specific policy off the top of my head right now, I couldn't speak to an actual piece of legislation that we're working on or engaging with, but we know that our partners in FRA, the American Wood Council, NAFO, we're having conversations with those folks. They share if they have a letter that's addressing a particular piece of legislation that they want us to sign on to, we'll review that. And as long as it's within the parameters of one of our national position statements, then we sign off on it and support it. A big conversation that was happening in the midst of the pandemic, and I think it's one of these dynamics that will continue to play out even latter end and hopefully post-pandemic, has to do with immigrant labor. And so what does that piece look like? How is that immigrant labor categorized when it comes to the type of visas that they get to work under? So that's something we work really closely with FRA on. Obviously, when it comes to just the different facets of what we do, I mean, everything comes into play. It's all interwoven. So truck weight limits and things of that nature. All that stuff we keep an eye on and continue to have these conversations. And we try to do our best to support and provide those national position statements so they do cover a broad range. Sometimes folks are like, well, there's not enough detail. There's not supposed to be. It's meant to cover the entire country and give someone something to work from, both from literature cited opportunities, as well as to say this is what SAF in essence has a position on related to transportation, sustaining our nation's forest, research, all these different parts and pieces, private land ownership, and small diameter material, carbon, climate. And those are all things that we continue to look at how we evolve, because honestly, the way we approached forest policy previously is that we actually had fairly, I refer to them as a thesis looking position statements that no one read. But they covered a lot, no one read them. So in the past about 3 to 4 years, we've switched to a more streamlined model of national position statements and really started breaking out the information so it's more topic specific than really broad-based reactionary type position statements. So sorry I can't give you specific legislation that we've been keeping an eye on, but we actually just added a policy person, and one of the things that we're doing with that additional capacity is looking at how we hold forums with policymakers about some of these basic things. And we also work with a group called the Forest Climate Working Group. They've been really engaged in some of those conversations as well that we help participate in, giving legislators some base information around forest products, biomass, all these different things that relate to the forest industry, especially related to climate. So with that, yeah, that's my 2 cents on that one.
Thank you, Terry. And that brings us to the wrap on time for the opening session here. And just want to remind you before we finish, the breakout sessions start at 3:30 on a short break here. See the details in your packet. And if you would, please help me in thanking Terry for an excellent keynote.